Cowboy has just been sold to its supplier for pennies. Vanmoof recently went bankrupt, and Rad Power Bikes also filed for bankruptcy just last year. These were the three biggest e-bike startups ever. Rad Power Bikes, for example, claimed that they owned 25% of the whole US e-bike markets for themselves before the downfall, while all three collected well over $100 million in funding each. Meanwhile, many smaller players like Angell, iGo Electric, Sushi Bikes, Dost Bikes, EBC Propeller, and more all joined the race, but then many of those got wiped out even more thoroughly. The e-bike startup bubble has now definitely popped, winter is here, and so it's time for a retrospective. I talked with Elliot Wertheimer, the new CEO of Vanmoof, who's been trying to turn things around after their bankruptcy in 2023, and also industry analyst Prabin Joel Jones to get an independent picture of the many things that went wrong and also to learn where things are headed to next. And what I found were not only some fascinating e-bike stories, but also some unexpected lessons for how bubbles form and pop in general. This video was sponsored by Brilliant. Electric bikes have overall been an incredibly obvious success story around the world. And as somebody who's been riding them for years, I have no doubt about the category being here to stay. In Germany, for example, where I live, people now own well over 15 million e-bikes. This statistic already deducts e-bikes that have been disposed of, by the way, and yet the numbers just keep growing. There's now one e-bike for every 5 Germans. In the US, e-bikes have outsold both electric cars and hybrids combined in some years, becoming the most popular type of EV in the country, and globally, you get a similar picture too. While they're definitely not for everyone, all major bike brands have made electrified models a significant part of their strategy, and startups have become serious players in the industry as well. Rad Power Bikes became the clear leader in North America with roughly 600,000 bikes sold by 2023. The Dutch Vanmoof claims that they've sold around 200,000 bikes before their bankruptcy. Cowboy's latest estimates put them close to 100,000 units, and there's a long tail of smaller startups with sizable operations as well. In other words, electrification is a megatrend that should have eventually floated all boats, and indeed, in the early days at least, there was a lot of genuine innovation and also excitement. In 2007, Mike Radenbaugh founded Rad Power Bikes in the US. E-bikes, as a category, didn't really exist in the West yet, and so he says that he hacked together his first e-bike with motors, batteries, and controllers that he ripped out of other devices himself. He claims that his janky creations immediately turned heads, and so he built the first major e-bike brand in the West on top of this foundation. Their bikes were comparably cheap, very powerful, and featured the iconic fat tires and throttles, which have become the hallmarks of the e-bike category in the US, where distances were long and regulations were loose. Meanwhile, in 2009, two Dutch brothers launched the Moof. This model did not have an electric drive just yet, but it already featured integrated lights and also a remarkably sleek design. Its successor, which now carried the Vanmoof brand, or the Vanmoof if you are Dutch I guess, well, that bike featured a chain that elegantly disappeared into the frame itself, letting you lock it up conveniently. Then in 2014, the first electric Vanmoof launched, which looked like the first truly aesthetic bike without the bulky components hanging off everywhere, and soon after, Vanmoof replaced its own chain innovation with the even more elegant combination of a kick lock, which blocked the back wheel along with built-in GPS tracking, an alarm signal, and also Vanmoof's own bike hunters who tracked stolen bikes down on behalf of their customers. As a result, people like my studio mate Kilian now routinely leave their Vanmoofs standing around in Berlin without even bothering to chain them up. Meanwhile, Cowboy from Belgium designed their first e-bike with a replaceable battery that elegantly fit into the overall design, and also popularized torque sensors, which sense how hard you pedal and automatically adjust the power output accordingly. There's no real need for gears in the city this way, and to this date, Cowboys are some of the smoothest riding e-bikes around. They also added a neat quad lock mount with wireless charging, they added fall detection to their bikes, and along with Vanmoof, they also made their apps kinda just really nice to use. The apps worked reliably, they connected to your bike instantly, and they just looked and felt really nice. Sounds trivial, but it really is not. In other words, the early days of the e-bike boom were driven by startups who brought a ton of innovation and especially attention to detail to the market. They didn't just slap a bunch of logos on a bunch of bikes that they bought from AliExpress, but instead they thoughtfully designed products that solved real customer pain points, like offering theft protection or having lights that you couldn't forget to charge. Having met a few of the founders myself and having listened to many interviews with others, it is incredibly obvious that these companies were built by people who are very passionate about building great products, and while there are always skeptics, customer demand was also very strong from the start. Rad launched their first bike with a Kickstarter campaign that immediately sold out, while Vanmoof and Cowboy grew like crazy too. In the early days, if you were riding a Vanmoof or a Cowboy in Berlin, people actually stopped you and asked you what you were riding. And even today, while I was filming, people came up to me and asked me what I was filming because the bikes looked so great. But behind the scenes, the first signs of danger started to appear. Being a successful startup in the 2010s meant one thing: raising loads of money, probably too much money from VCs, and the e-bike makers were no different. What we now often refer to as the era of 0% interest rate loans meant that there was simply too much VC money chasing too few good companies, and so this dynamic pushed the companies who did have some traction to just get flooded with cash. Rad raised $329 million, Vanmoof around $200 million, and Cowboy around 140 million euros. Now, it is of course not inherently a bad thing if a startup raises a lot of money. After all, this allows them to, for example, develop cool new features and also to scale up. But beyond a certain point, the flood creates a mad race for hypergrowth at all costs that ends up being extremely disruptive. Take Vanmoof, for example. Their next big bikes were the S3 and X3. These were great bikes in theory, except the company rushed them to market because they felt that they now had to beat the competition that also raised a ton of money, and so they released these with loads of quality control issues. Their e-shifter, for example, was fundamentally unreliable from the start and broke for every Vanmoof owner that I know. The boost button routinely broke from exposure to rain, which is a mild problem when Vanmoof's biggest market was the Netherlands. Their control electronics were pretty unreliable, and the list goes on. Meanwhile, despite being way more technically complex than its predecessor, Vanmoof also dropped its prices for the 3 Series to under 2,000 euros. Every estimate that I found said that the company was now losing money on each bike that they sold this way. But simultaneously, they also expanded more heavily into the US, Japan, and beyond, and they also opened up stores like crazy, all of which cost a ton of money and spread them way too thin. This is the classic VC-backed blitzscaling model. A company tries to grow very rapidly, it tries to undercut all of its competitors, so hopefully many of them go bankrupt, and once it has become the dominant player in the industry, it then raises its prices. Of course, COVID then hit too and turned things up to an even crazier level. On the one hand, demand for e-bikes exploded as people wanted to skip public transportation and millions of people started to view biking as a legitimate form of commuting. You can see that Cowboy, for example, almost tripled their revenues in 2022, while the CEO of Rad Power Bikes said at a podcast that they increased theirs by 300% a year. But while demand went through the roof, factories and shipping lines closed, and the companies experienced huge supply chain bottlenecks. Now, if you were lucky as a customer, then all this meant for you was that your bike perhaps got a little bit delayed. If you were a bit less lucky, then you perhaps already had a bike that broke and now you had to wait months on end for your spare parts to arrive, leaving you functionally bikeless in the meanwhile. And if you were particularly unlucky, as I and many others were, then you became the not-so-proud owner of what I would call a COVID bike, a bike that the company kind of Frankensteined together from whatever parts they could find on the market. See, after testing out a review unit and really liking it, I, like seemingly everybody else as well, decided to get a Cowboy for myself right in the middle of the pandemic. But unlike my reliable seeming review unit, my actual bike was anything but reliable. I got a flat tire 3 times in a row in the first week, despite replacing my tubes. My bike frame creaked constantly from the start, and the most critical parts were the brakes. They broke 5 times in a row for me, sometimes in the front, sometimes in the back, sometimes both. I replaced each part individually. I also replaced the entire braking system twice. Nothing helped. My bike was basically permanently unusable. Meanwhile, I also share a studio with multiple guys who all had their own versions of COVID bikes from Vanmoof and Cowboy, and they all had similarly horrible experiences. Now, I actually managed to get one of the Cowboy founders to admit to me during an event that they had to switch to many temporary suppliers because they just couldn't get their hands on the usual stuff that they were used to buying, and that's certainly what my bike felt like. And while that sort of stuff was horrible for customers, it was of course also catastrophic for the companies. Tripling or quadrupling their sales during the pandemic must have sounded great until they realized that they had just sold a ton of bikes that very quickly turned into a mountain of unfixable warranty cases for them. And because these bikes also relied on many custom components and were sold in a direct-to-consumer model rather than through regular bike shops, the brands had to bear all the costs of fixing these issues themselves. Now, eventually, supply chains did of course normalize and the brands were able to fix many of their quality issues. Just as an anecdotal example, after what I think might have been my 7th failed repair attempt, Cowboy just decided to send me a replacement bike, which was supposedly the same model, except I noticed that almost all of its parts, from its charger to its brakes, were swapped out for ones from different suppliers. I have now ridden 3,600 kilometers on my replacement bike, and as you can tell, I don't exactly go easy on it, but the thing has thankfully been rock solid. In other words, I'm pretty happy right now, but that's no excuse for what happened. Tons of other riders are still out there with broken bikes, and the brand suffered tremendously as well. Not only have they lost their customers' trust and racked up millions of dollars of warranty expenses, I also heard that smaller brands especially were so desperate for any supply of any components during the height of the pandemic that many signed multi-year contracts with suppliers that they couldn't easily back out of even once they discovered that some of their parts weren't reliable enough. Imagine having binding contracts that mean you have to buy components that you know are not going to be good enough. That just seems crazy right now, but remember, just a couple of years ago, many really smart people, including people like the founder of Rad Power Bikes, thought that this boom was really here to stay.
We think a switch was flipped on, the light has been shed on e-bikes as a tool for the masses.
Yeah.
And so now it's not so much about just keeping up with this demand that has spiked from COVID-19, people working from home, shopping from home, looking for social distance ways to get around. But this is a switch that is flipped on and it's not turning off.
So the companies often went all out on building up production capacities. But in retrospect, we now know, of course, that the pandemic era boom was mostly temporary. Rad Power Bikes, for example, saw their revenues cut in half in the last 3 years. And it's a similar picture for Cowboy from their peak in 2022. As it turns out, yes, people did want their e-bikes, but no, COVID was a temporary distortion that just drew a few years of demand forward. And even worse, for Cowboy, we also know what their losses look like, and these remained stubbornly high even as their revenue dropped. As it turns out, they still have to spend money on fixing the mountains of broken e-bikes that they sold during the COVID crunch. And in fact, it wasn't just the startups that overproduced. The experts that I've talked to, like Prabin, have told me that the traditional bike brands all did the same too, and that even in 2026, years after the COVID frenzy, bike shops are still oversupplied with bikes that brands rushed to produce and couldn't sell until today, all of which is still fueling a painful price war across the industry. Given all of this, it's unsurprising then that the e-bike industry has had a very rough few years recently. Add to this that VC investments in general have dropped significantly since 2022, since the interest rates started rising and all the cheap capital dried up, and many of the VCs turned to their e-bike companies and said, yeah, thanks, that's about it for us now, you're not getting any more money from us. Meanwhile, the last straw that broke the backs of the US exposed e-bike companies like Rad Power Bikes especially were the introduction of tariffs. While Cowboy, for example, both makes and sells most of their e-bikes in Europe, most of the other e-bike startups build theirs in China or Taiwan, and if those were expected to sell their units in the US, they saw Trump's trade war turn their business model significantly more difficult overnight. Combining all of these things, it's unsurprising that one by one, almost all the e-bike startups collapsed, and in fact, almost everybody suffered. Customers were left with unrepairable bikes, employees lost their jobs, suppliers overbuilt their factories, and yes, even the investors essentially saw their shares go to zero. This collapse was incredibly disruptive for many. That said, I don't actually think that everything is lost. In fact, I've talked to the new CEO of Vanmoof who's been trying to turn things around over there. Now, the whole interview, along with the one that I made with Prabin, are of course up on Nebula with tons of interesting details that I couldn't fit into this episode, but here are my highlights from the turnaround. Vanmoof was the first of the big startups to collapse in 2023, and then they were acquired by McLaren Applied, a firm that normally focuses on engineering for the racing industry. They have spent the last 2.5 years or so now trying to fix the company that they acquired, and I expect others to follow in their footsteps as well. Now, Vanmoof officially went through the bankruptcy process, which is specifically designed to allow a new owner to come in and make radical changes. They can choose which part of the business they want to take over and which they don't. They do not have to inherit the firm's liabilities, including to its suppliers and even existing customers, and so on. It's a fresh new start. So the first thing that McLaren Applied did was downsize the company from roughly 700 employees to 100. Second, they massively scaled down development for speculative new technologies. Third, they stopped selling bikes for at least a year and focused on just fixing the most glaring reliability issues in production. Fourth, they closed down all of Vanmoof's own offline stores and abandoned the so-called direct-to-consumer model. Instead, they partnered with bike stores and retailers who could now sell Vanmoof bikes but would also help repair them, which allowed Vanmoof to massively expand their repair network. Elliot told me that they now sell about 80% of their bikes through third-party shops and also that they now have about 350 or so partners. Fifth, at least for now, they left markets like the US or Japan where they were weak and handed over support to local partners. Sixth, they significantly raised prices, with the S6, for example, now costing €3,300. This allowed them to give their new retail partners a decent cut, and while it did slow down sales, it also now made selling bikes actually profitable. And seventh, they released first the S5 and then the S6, both of which just focused on essentially being slightly improved, slightly more reliable versions of their existing bikes. Elliot told me that the S6, for example, is at least 16 times as reliable as their problem child, the S3 was. Now, I obviously can't verify this number and we should take it with a grain of salt, but what I can say is that Kilian is riding an S6. He seems to be happy with it. He says he doesn't really have any major issues, and other people that I could find on the internet seem mostly satisfied as well, so there's definitely some improvement. And in fact, in our conversation, Elliot told me the following.
So we restarted sales, I think, in May 2024, and now we're back in the tens of thousands of units per year level. Which is very, very good, especially because of the increase in prices. So if you adjust like for our pricing now, I think we're more or less at the same levels as the host company in terms of financial performance.
So
and in terms of volume.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, in terms of volumes and how things are moving, we're more or less equivalent to that.
Not bad. So they're still down in terms of units, but they have now recovered in terms of revenue. Anyway, this strategy is pretty simple. Stop with the crazy expansion and just focus on fixing the core. Once you have, you might not go into a hyper-growth mode right away, but you can build a sustainable business. Cowboy, meanwhile, did not officially go bankrupt, but they were bought by the Rebirth Group. This is a French company that manufactures many other bike brands, including Peugeot-branded ones too. I actually own a Peugeot Steel 2 bike myself, which I love, and so ironically, this means that I now own 2 bikes from the Rebirth Group. Anyway, this group took over the manufacturing of Cowboy bikes before the firm actually collapsed, and then they just bought whatever was left from them recently. And while they were unwilling to give me any concrete details at the time of writing this video, because they are in the process of restructuring right now, it seems like the plan is pretty much the same as it is with Vanmoof. Now, Rebirth Group is not a flashy startup, they don't have crazy ideas, I guess, they're just a boring old company, and I think that is exactly what Cowboy needs right now. They've built a new production line for Cowboy and have just started up production in January again. They will almost certainly focus on downsizing things and stabilizing issues, and I also bet that they'll start selling Cowboy bikes through traditional bike shops. Prices might increase, and I guess innovative projects will be put on ice until things are stable. And while that's kind of a shame, hopefully in a couple of years Cowboy will return to being a healthy company, just like Vanmoof appears to have by now. Now, I'm less certain about what will happen to American firms because the tariff situation there is impossible to predict, and also because there's quite a lot of regulatory backlash against e-bikes as the country has been flooded with unsafe batteries and also bikes that are basically high-powered electric mopeds that just pretend to be bicycles. Fixing that will take some time, but still, I bet things will level out eventually as well. Because in the end, I like to think about what happened to e-bikes using this graph. This line represents the kind of natural growth rate of the category, driven by batteries, motors and such getting better and cheaper, and also by cities building more bike lanes and such. But then artificially cheap VC money was added to the mix, which put the industry in overdrive, and COVID took that to a whole new level. Short term, that might have looked like a win, but in reality, a bunch of people just got burned, businesses collapsed, faith in manufacturers faded, and in some cases it even led to regulatory backlash. But now that the bubble has burst and the cleanup has begun, I believe the market can eventually return to growth again. Now, designing or even fixing things like e-bikes requires a complex set of hardware and software skills, and if learning about those in detail sounds interesting to you, then my sponsor Brilliant has fantastic courses for you. Their course called Circuits, for example, is an amazing introduction to how electricity and electric systems work in general. They start from the basic building blocks and they work their way up to more complex topics. Meanwhile, Digital Circuits expands your knowledge into how computer chips and the systems built on top of those work. This one takes you from the ones and zeros all the way through to the logical building blocks of the chips and explains how tasks are executed. These two are a fantastic duo to start with, and there are also a ton of other great courses on Brilliant covering computer science, engineering, and more. The special sauce of Brilliant is that you learn really complex topics on the platform, but you do so by practicing each segment Brilliant with an interactive exercise. Not only is this approach really fun, but it also makes learning way more effective, and it ensures that you actually understand and remember things. Meanwhile, the platform also personalizes learnings for you. It starts you at the right level based on your background, and it helps you advance at your ideal pace. Brilliant is crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals at MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Caltech, Google, and more. Whether you want to advance your career or just learn something new for fun, Brilliant can be an awesome tool. And with my link, brilliant.org/TechAltar, which is also in the description, or with the QR code on screen, you can try Brilliant for free for 30 days, and doing so will also get you 20% off an annual premium plan if you choose to get one. That gets you unlimited daily access, so happy learning, and I'll see you in the next video.